A warm welcome to Chapter 1 of our textbook. I've made this PowerPoint with material from the textbook we're going to be using this term, as well as another textbook that I've used in the past.
Now, I won't be laying this out for each chapter, but if you want to get an overview of a chapter, look in the table of contents, and each chapter has a list of topics. So, for instance, we have learning outcomes, the introduction, what is visual art, who is considered an artist, what does it mean to be an artist, the role of the viewer, why do we make art, concepts explored in later chapters, giving you an overview of the rest of the textbook, and a few questions to ask yourself before moving on to the next chapter. How well have you learned the material? And then there's a glossary at the end of each chapter. At the beginning of each chapter, you'll find a list of learning outcomes. These are really important, and it gives you a little heads up as to what to expect in the chapter. So for this one, after completing the chapter, you should be able to recognize various historical arguments about the definition of art and who is an artist, engage arguments that distinguish between art and craft, critically evaluate claims about whether an object is or is not art from multiple points of view, and engage questions about who is considered an artist and the role of the viewer. You will be able to productively speculate about various reasons why people have made and continue to make art, and recognize your intuitive understanding of art and potentially build a broader, more comprehensive view of the nature and definition of visual art, one which incorporates historically and culturally diverse art objects and answers conceptual challenges. Our textbook uses this painting as a kind of metaphor for the fragility of culture and the need for our cultural heritage to be brought forward through time. And to repeat my query from my initial PowerPoint, my welcome PowerPoint, when we look at the Mona Lisa here, how do we actually know this painting is art? One of the questions we'll ask ourselves in this course is, what is art, or our book's version, what is visual art more specifically? And remember Heidegger's version from my welcome introduction. I made this graphical representation of what he was talking about in the convoluted quote that I read you, about how every aspect of art seems to depend on the other component. So the concept of art seems to be a kind of dialogue across this middle from one aspect to the other. After that first video, I came up with this new diagram. Maybe these concepts, artist, work of art, and viewer really revolve around the concept of art. Here's an amazing view of a reconstruction of the sculptor Constantin Brancusi's studio in Paris. You can visit this near the Pompidou Center. The question of what is and isn't art actually came up with regard to Brancusi. An American photographer had imported one of Brancusi's bronze sculptures in the 1920s, and he was forced to pay import duties on it because the customs agent decided that it was not a work of art but just a piece of bronze. It was the bronze version of this sculpture here. This is actually a marble version, I believe. So the case went to court, and I'm not sure how high up it went, but eventually it was determined that yes, indeed, it was a work of art. Of course, it took the court to do this, right? And no, the American photographer did not need to pay an import duty on it since it wasn't just a raw material. Since Brancusi's sculpture was called Bird in Space, we can forgive the customs agent, I suppose, who didn't recognize it as a sculpture of a bird. Here's something interesting that Brancusi said: "They are imbeciles who call my work abstract. That which they call abstract is the most realistic, because what is real is not the exterior, but the idea, the essence of things." What is visual art then? Our book discusses this in terms of both theories and definitions, I think you could say. So a theory would be, in my mind, how art works. A definition is what it is. And our book is sort of going back and forth between the two. But first off, there's the ancient Greek version of mimesis, basically mimicry, that art is an imitation or copy of the world. There's Tolstoy's version from the 19th century, which I particularly like, which is that art communicates the artist's feeling to another person. The significant form version is from the early 20th century. It's more of an aesthetic theory like that of Immanuel Kant, which we'll see in a later chapter. An aesthetic theory is basically that art can be separated from its specific sort of narrative or story meaning and just be enjoyed for shapes, forms, and colors and that sort of thing. Our book's discussion continues with the art world theory of George Dickey and Arthur Danto. This is what you'd call an institutional theory, where art is whatever the art world says it is. So it's a collective definition, in other words. Our authors seem to particularly dislike this version and many of the previous versions too, because of the impossibility of proving the validity. Now, our authors give their own definition of art. This is their favorite version, or so it would seem, that art moves ideas from the mind into the world. Now, I don't see that they can actually prove that this is better than the other theories, but they think it's better than the other theories. Now, there are many more versions of what art is. We will just be exploring a few of them, and just bear in mind that a hard and fast theory or definition probably cannot be and never will be found. One of the most effective discussions in this chapter in our book is about who is considered an artist and what does it mean to be an artist. The image on the left from the ancient era, from what is now present-day Iraq, and the one on the right from ancient Greece. These were made by people who were considered either to be craftsmen or craftswomen, or artisans, not really artists. This idea of an artist as a kind of inspired genius is a much more modern idea. I'll let you read for yourselves about the painting on a scroll on the left by a Chinese scholar painter from about 500 years ago, and how this gentleman would not have been considered to be a professional artist, but a kind of specialist, or what they called literati. So someone who's well educated, but not specifically as a visual artist. But this was often preferred to that of the visual artist, the sort of professional artist. And then the image on the right is by James Whistler, and he was very much the sort of what we'd consider the contemporary sort of inspired genius version of the artist. This is from the 19th century. So what are we supposed to do when we look at a work of art? We'll be talking about this more during the course of this class. And this particular painting is what you'd call trompe-l'oeil, or that's French for fool the eye. And the book's discussion surrounding this has to do with we become complicit in a kind of enjoyment of the fakery that this painting provides. This is not postcards and little tidbits sitting on apparently like a drawer frame laying flat. These are all painted on flat canvas. And to go back 20,000 years or so, what would have been our role as a viewer in a cave in southern France, south of where the glaciers, where the ice flows were? What were we as viewer? Were we shaman, priests, that kind of thing? Was the kind of general public? of the tribe that these people lived in? Were they the intended viewers? And then what were these paintings actually for? I've borrowed this from a textbook called Living with Art, which I've used in at other schools in the past. I like this idea of the key to looking at art is to become aware of the process of looking. And I want you to think of that during this course. Think of how you are looking and responding to different works of art. And then also how you filter information so that you can respond to what it is you're looking at that moment. In a sense, our consciousness filters out extraneous information so that we can better understand the world around us. I've included this image because I really enjoy the optical illusion of the skull versus the beautiful young woman looking at herself in the mirror. This is called the Vanitas painting, which emphasizes the transience of our earthly lives. Here's an earlier version of the same theme of the earthly, the transience of our earthly lives, with all this stuff representing wealth, and a more contemporary version with some more recent items like the lipstick. Now, this painting is intended to have an effect on the viewer in the sense that we are supposed to sense this idea of the fleeting nature of life. Or how about our response to something like this? If you don't get close to it, if you just see it from this distance in the gallery, you won't see that this work is sewn together of little tiny flower petals. I believe they're made out of plastic. So I just want to point out that the viewer's experience can change even in the same place at the same time, depending on your distance from the work of art. So try to keep an open mind when you're looking at the images throughout this course. We won't be seeing a lot of works of art in person, but in some ways we can emulate the experience of being in the museum, I hope. We saw in some of the previous slides of the Vanitas paintings that the artist seems to want to convey a message of the transience of our earthly existence, but is that the only reason why we make art? No, not just to tell a story, a kind of moralistic story. This image here is of some sea snail shells that have been have had holes drilled in them to form a kind of necklace, apparently. And these are about 70,000 years old. Now, when I've taught art history and art appreciation over the years, every 10 years or so, we seem to find something that's even older than the previous iteration of the oldest known works of art. So this is about the oldest one I've ever seen in my brief career teaching this kind of course, these necklace shells. The previous example of the necklace shells, that might have been just the desire for personal adornment. It's hard to say after all these years, but in general, the desire to make art, that kind of drive to make art, stems from either a personal need or a communal need or some kind of combination of both. And our book does a really nice job of kind of threading the needle on this. Again, from another textbook, a couple of interesting bullet points. What we know of human history indicates that no society has lived without some form of art. And also the ability to make images is uniquely human, and it is the starting point for creating art. Living with Art continues to construct meaningful images and forms, to create order and structure, to explore aesthetic possibilities. These characteristics seem to be part of our nature as human beings. From them, art has grown, nurtured by each culture in its own way. And I'm hoping that we can have a discussion about, throughout the course, of other approaches that we might have to making and viewing art. So the desire to make art, that kind of drive to make art, seems to be built into us as humans. And yet, art often serves purposes that are more directed, shall we say, like building, the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., meant to serve a purpose, meant to convey an idea, this idea of justice and stability. Or Rodin's Burghers of Calais sculpture, which shows, is a kind of homage to the town leaders of Calais in France, who were willing to sacrifice themselves in order to save the citizenry during a fight with the English hundreds of years ago. And to conclude here, I'd recommend you read the Concepts Explored in Later Chapters section. It gives a nice overview of the textbook. And as a reminder, you would probably want to answer the questions. You don't have to really write them down, but just think about them. The before you move on section, ask some important questions about what you've read about in the textbook. And then again, the key terms is a kind of glossary of terminology used in this chapter. And I hope this helps.